and welcome to episode 6. In today's episode, I begin a 5-part series on the subject of children and war. This is a new section in the 3rd volume of my book series, Our Service, Our Stories. For the first 8 years of my interviewing people, I was focused on adult veterans and adult civilian workers. But I became aware more recently of several adults in the retirement community in which I work that had significant childhood or young adult experiences during World War II. I discovered that their experiences were both dramatic and informative, helping me to gain a better understanding on the full impact of World War II, not only on those who fought it, but on the children and families who endured it. Here's Children and War. During the next 5 episodes, I'll share the stories of Eva Hermazinski, a teenager in Poland caught in the dual invasion of Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, Helen, or Magdalena, a German girl whose family lived in the former Yugoslavia and was forced to leave her home and live in a liquidation camp when the communist Serbian partisans arrived. Janet Mackenzie, a girl in London who experienced both evacuation and the bombing of the city of London in 1940. Colette Reinierson-Piercy, a little girl of 7 who witnessed the Japanese attack of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And Jean Umemura, a Japanese-American teen whose family was forced to leave their home in Seattle and live for over 2 years in an internment camp in Idaho. For this episode, I'll focus on Jean Kano Umemura. Jean and her twin brother John were born in 1926 in Seattle, Washington. Their older sister Mary had arrived 4 years earlier in 1922. Both of Jean's parents were born in Japan and had immigrated to America. Although both her father and mother loved the United States, the Immigration Act of 1924 prevented them from becoming naturalized American citizens. In 1937, Jean's mother took the children to visit the extended family in Japan. When the kids were asked if they were going to move back to Japan, Jean replied, "Oh no, we're Americans." Jean and her family had a happy life in Seattle. They lived in a mostly white area. Few Japanese families were there, but they were well enough integrated into their community. The kids enjoyed school and friends, and the family attended a local church. Jean's father owned a successful dry cleaning business. Jean played the piano, her older sister Mary played the violin, and John enjoyed sports. The Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, forever changed their lives. The day after, on December 8th, Jean, by this time a 9th grade student, sat in the school assembly listening to President Roosevelt announce over the radio the attack of Pearl Harbor and declare war in his famous Day of Infamy speech. Jean became self-conscious, thinking that her classmates were looking at her. Barely 2 months after the attack, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942. It granted authority to the United States Army in the Western Military Zone of the United States to evacuate anyone determined to be a threat to the security of the West Coast. The only people that were ever considered to be a threat were the 120,000 Japanese people living along the coast that were evacuated. 70% of them were United States citizens by birth. The exclusion area is shown on the map. It consisted of half of the state of Washington and Oregon, all of California, and the lower half of Arizona. Any Japanese residents living in those areas were determined to be a threat. Caught in the frenzied paranoia of Pearl Harbor, Authorities feared that Japanese residents living on the West Coast might try to collaborate with the Japanese military in staging future attacks on the mainland. The War Relocation Authority hastily built 10 remote internment camps to house the 120,000 Japanese who would be forced to leave their homes and businesses. They were mostly located in the western states, although 2 of the camps were in the state of Arkansas. They were always in remote areas far away from concentrations of other Americans. Seattle's Japanese residents were evacuated between April 28 and May 12, 1942. "They made us get rid of everything," recalled Jean. "Our home and all our belongings. My father had to give up his business. It was hard." They were taken initially to temporary assembly centers set up at various places along the West Coast until the permanent camps could be built. Jean and her family were taken to a state fairground in the state of Washington, where they lived for 4 months while waiting for their camp to be built. In September of 1942, the Kano family boarded trains and traveled east for 30 hours. From a train station, they boarded buses for the final leg of their journey. They finally arrived at their new home, Camp Minidoka, in southern Idaho. The camp was 20 miles northeast of the city of Twin Falls in the southern part of the state and encompassed over 34,000 acres. It mostly consisted of high desert, sagebrush, plenty of dirt, and extreme temperatures of heat and cold. It was nothing like the lush green coast of Washington with the abundant rainfall they had enjoyed. Instead, they had to get accustomed to the hot, dry, and very isolated desert. Worse yet, they had to adjust to living in cramped, hastily built wooden barracks with tar paper. Dirt blew into the cracks of the barracks whenever the wind blew. Built to hold over 10,000 people, the sprawling city of 600 hastily built wood barracks stretched across 946 acres in the central camp. Spread out in a crescent shape, like the stands of a Major League Baseball stadium, were 36 blocks of barracks. Each block consisted of 12 individual barracks holding approximately 250 residents, a mess hall, a laundry and sanitary building, and a recreation hall. Jean's family was placed in Block 21, which is circled in red just left of center on the map. In time, the agriculturally gifted Japanese internees planted massive community gardens sprawling across 243 acres along the eastern edge of the camp. It was all maintained by the Japanese. They raised a diverse mix of vegetables, all of which were used in feeding the camp residents. And they also created ball fields for their children. Each barrack building was 20 foot by 120 foot and was divided into individual units to hold multiple families. The separate living spaces had only a bare light bulb and a coal-burning stove in the middle. It had very limited space and almost no privacy. Certain barracks were designated for schools. After a delay, the schools finally opened. Jean and her brother attended their final years of high school at Camp Minidoka. The high school was given the name Hunt High School. In the photo, students from Jean's high school are working on the ground just outside the barrack classroom. It was a sprawling city of 10,000 residents, but it was in the middle of nowhere. It was cramped, it was isolated, the people were confined, imprisoned. This is a photo at left of the Minidoka Irrigator weekly newspaper from March 13, 1943. It highlights 300 Japanese men from the camp that were volunteering for military service. Japanese men were recruited back into military service by 1943, due largely to a great need for soldier replacements in combat zones. Japanese Nisei citizens in the relocation camps were required to register for the draft. They were called to fight for the freedom of others and imprisoned when they refused, even though they themselves were denied that same freedom in the internment camps. By the end of the war, over 30,000 Japanese Nisei had served in the United States Army, most of them in the The Kano family's ticket out of the internment camp eventually came through their older daughter, Mary. Mary had not been forced into an internment camp because she was a student at Washington State University, which was located east of the Cascade Mountain Range. One summer, she met a chaplain from the University of Michigan who was attending a pastor's camp conference at a Baptist camp in Wisconsin, where Mary and others had been invited to spend the summer playing her violin. This chaplain befriended Mary and took an interest in helping her family get out of Camp Minidoka. He advised Mary to transfer to the University of Michigan, where he could then arrange for her family to be relocated to Ann Arbor. In early 1945, after 2.5 years of internment, the Kano family finally left behind their life of confinement and began their next chapter. Jean eventually enrolled at Michigan State Normal, today Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti, and began in teacher training. She graduated with an art education degree in 1949. Jean taught art for a year in a school in Portland, Oregon, where she was also then able to visit some of her former friends from Seattle. She returned to the Midwest after that year to marry George Umemura in 1950. They had briefly met while they were living in Seattle with their families, but he was 3 years older. Both George and Jean became reacquainted while Jean and her family had moved to Ann Arbor. The couple was blessed with 3 children. For a time, they lived on the East Coast before coming to Indianapolis, where George worked at Eli Lilly, and Jean later taught 5th grade at Allison Middle School for 30 years. Neither Jean nor George thought to share their internment camp experience with their children or anyone else for many years. Their lives were busy enough, just raising a family and focusing on their careers. But one day, when their children were in high school, they came across a sidebar on the history texts that spoke of the Japanese-American internment. The kids asked their parents if they knew of this and if they had heard of it. Both George and Jean then revealed they not only heard of the camps, they had lived in them. Later, after both George and Jean retired, they began traveling to area schools and sharing their experiences of Japanese-American internment during World War II. Jean just gave her final presentation of her experiences to her retirement community a few weeks ago. Extraordinary story, isn't it? And Jean Umemura is an extraordinary person. The decades following the West Coast internment of Japanese saw continued debate over whether President Roosevelt and the federal government had violated the Constitution and Bill of Rights in the evacuation and confinement of Japanese citizens during World War II. And it's pretty clear they had. In 1976, President Gerald Ford signed Proclamation 4417, in which he stated, "We now know what we should have known then, not only that evacuation was wrong, but that Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans." In 1988, over 40 years after the sad chapter of evacuation and internment, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, acknowledging the error of the government and the injustice to the Japanese who were confined, and offering reparation payments in the amount of $20,000 for surviving internees. Throughout their lives, Jean and George and their parents, as I'm sure most Japanese American residents, maintained a patriotic commitment to the United States despite the injustices that had been committed against them in the internment during World War II. To learn more of Jean's experience, read her story in Volume 3 of my book. If you care to, you can also hear Jean describe her experiences and me talk about Japanese American internment in the podcast of a radio show, Hoosier History Live, that played on May 28. I also touch on some of the other stories of the children and teens in my book. That's it for this episode. Join me next time for the story of Colette, who at age 7 witnessed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Thanks for tuning in.